Hey everyone, welcome back to Emma's Pearls. Today we have Kimberly and Kyle Walker, who is a historian and a counselor at BYU Idaho. Kyle, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Yeah, I've been at BYU Idaho now for 20 plus years and have researched on the Smith family for most of that time. I have a PhD in marriage and family therapy from BYU, and during my graduate studies, I was allowed to do kind of a unique dissertation. I did my dissertation on the family dynamics of the Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith family. And so that's where I started to research on the Smith family. I did a book back in 2006 on each member of the family, a little biography on each member of the family. And in that research, I discovered there were a couple of family members that there was a lot of material on. One of those was William Smith, and that led to a biography that I wrote on William in 2016, and then more recently, Katherine Smith Salisbury, who we're going to talk about today, and I've published a biography of her just this past year.
Great. Um, so I'm curious about searching through and learning about the family. How did that help you as a marriage and family therapist? Did we have a lot of issues that need to be worked through?
Well, I sort of looked at maybe the other way. I thought maybe I could use some of the marriage and family skills that I had learned to examine a historical family. So that's kind of a unique approach. Some people have done kind of psychological diagnoses and tried to apply those to historical figures, and I think that's a bit dangerous. But to try to diagnose the dead, but I think it did provide a framework of looking at some different dynamics that maybe others hadn't looked at before. So maybe I can talk about some of those things that I learned. But
Yeah, that's awesome.
yeah,
Yeah, so I say we dive into Katherine Smith and her relation to Joseph and the things that you have learned.
okay. Yeah, feel free to ask me any questions as we go along. Catherine is the middle daughter in the Smith family, the middle of three, and she's probably the only sister that you could write a full-length biography on. The other sisters, there's just not enough material on them to write a full-length biography. But Catherine's the longest surviving member of the Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith family. She lives until 1900. And because of that longevity, she had a lot of opportunities to write letters and be interviewed, and a lot of material has survived because of that.
So how old was she that when she died?
She was born in 1813, dies in 1900, so she dies at age 86 when she passes away. Catherine, I often mention this too. There's just not too many early members of the church, female early members of the church, that you could write a biography on. I'll bet there's not more than 10 that there's enough surviving materials on that you could write a biography on a female born before 1820 member of the church. So she was one of those that you could do that on, and so I think that's very important to tell women's stories in church history. Also being a member of the founding family of the church, the Smith family, so she's an insider. She's there when Joseph brings home the plates. She's there when Joseph comes home with the plates. She's there when he's telling his stories of the first vision and of the plates. And so we've got this kind of first-hand witness of some of these events, of these earliest foundational events of the Restoration. So I think it's important to tell her story. She grows up, basically the only childhood home she knows is on the farm in Palmyra, Manchester. She's 4 years old when they moved to that area, and that would have been, like I say, the only childhood home she would have known. I think her childhood consisted of farm work and probably faith. I think Lucy Mack Smith probably divided chores based on hardiness. Her older sister Sophronia, health was rather fragile, and oftentimes she's sick. Several times she comes near dying, if you'll recall, in Lucy Mack Smith's history. Catherine, on the other hand, by contrast, was very hardy, very robust. They said that she could do the work of most men. And so it appears that she may have divided the chores by having Sophronia do some of the inside chores while Catherine is doing a lot of the barnyard chores. So she's milking a cow, she's bringing the sheep in at night and letting them graze during the day. She's chopping wood. In fact, I might just mention milking the cow became one of her favorite activities. And she will milk a cow throughout her entire life. So the months leading up to her death at age 86, she has pneumonia and she has breast cancer, and she's still milking that cow within 24 hours of her death. And so,
Oh, wow.
she
Oh,
always
wow.
had this pet cow that she liked to milk that would follow her around almost like a dog in later life as she would do some of her barnyard chores. So, but very strong. They said that she was 5 to 6 inches taller than the average woman of the day. So I estimate that to be around 5'9", 5'10". Got some pictures of Catherine. Some people commented on her hands, how big her hands were and how strong her hands were. Could do the work of most men. In fact, in Nauvoo, during kind of precarious times after Joseph and Hiram were killed, sometimes she was a little afraid of stepping out of the house because she thought she might be mistaken for some of the men due to her height. But very tall, very robust. Catherine, I do have an account of a dinner scene in Palmyra. Stephen Harding later served as the governor of Utah Territory, but was raised in Palmyra, had dinner with the Smith family. And he recounts that I saw two stout, barefooted girls come into the house, and I think that was Catherine and daughter Lucy, each with a tin bucket of red raspberries. Soon after, the old man, Joseph Sr., announced that supper was ready. We went into the other part of the house where supper was waiting, consisting of brown bread, milk, and an abundance of fine raspberries. There was no lack of these, and if any left the table without a really good supper, it was not the fault of the hostess. I remarked that the supper was good enough for a king, and the berries on the table were better than can be bought in any city in America. So just a little glimpse there into the sisters contributing to the evening meals. Also, I think that besides farm work, the children were instructed at a young age from the Bible. Recall that both Lucy and Joseph Sr. taught their children to read from the Bible, and Catherine had some recollections of that. Lucy, one time, Mother Lucy, speaking to some saints in Nauvoo, talked about her parenting strategies. She said she emphasized the central role that religious instruction had played in her approach to child rearing. I raised them in the fear of God, she began. From the age of 2 or 3 years old, I told them I wanted them to love God with all their hearts. I told them to do good. She then recounted how she had taught her children the stories of the Bible from a young age, about Joseph in Egypt and such things. She underscored that if mothers listening to her that day would do the same, when your children are 4 years old, they will love to read their Bible. And so you see that influence on the Smith children, including Catherine. As you look at her letters in later life, they're just brimming with biblical references. And the Bible was very important to Catherine. We think she attended the Palmyra Sunday School at the Presbyterian Church with her brother William, who attended and left some recollections of that time period. Catherine also plays a little bit of a role with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. She talks about her disappointment in not being able to see the plates when Joseph brought them home, how they had to be covered. But she also leaves an account very similar to Emma's of moving the plates around the home. And so you have this first-hand account. She said this: I hefted the plates and found them very heavy. I estimated they weighed about 60 pounds. She then examined them more closely, rippling her fingers up the edges of the plates, and felt they were separate metal plates, and heard the tinkle of the sound that they made, noting they were held together by 3 rings. So if you recall, Emma has a very similar account of kind of moving those plates around.
Yeah.
And I think the family played a role, if you look at Lucy Mack Smith's history of protecting the plates. And when Joseph is unable to obtain the plates and he has to have those annual visits with Moroni, Lucy Mack Smith says something interesting in her history. She says, "We redoubled our efforts so that we would be worthy to bring forth this sacred record."
Yeah.
And so the whole family's kind of rallying around Joseph. And Catherine said the same thing in a later account. She says, "I stand before you a remnant of the family that brought forth the sacred record." So kind of this collective mission with bringing forth the plates. There's a fun story about Catherine and Sophronia protecting the plates on one occasion. We don't know what the circumstances were, but for some reason Joseph had the plates wrapped outside of the home. Catherine said that he opened the front door just as her brother came running up, and he was panting for breath, and in a gasping voice whispered hoarsely, "Take these quickly and hide them." Catherine was obviously prepared for such a circumstance by this point. She took the bundle from Joseph to her room where she and Sophronia slept. Sophronia pulled back the covers, Catherine placed the bundle on the bed, and then they replaced the covers, pretending to be asleep. The mob, failing to find Joseph outside, returned to the house to search. "But they did not disturb us," said Catherine, "since we appeared to be sleeping." And so she would often recount that story to her grandchildren in later life of
Do you
helping to.
know about how old she would have been at that point?
Let's see, so that would have been 1827, so probably about 14 years old.
Wow.
She also talked about kind of a mob being around the house almost every night. I think that's interesting from a teenage girl's perspective. I don't know if that was true, that they were around every night, but that she remembered it that way kind of highlights some of the apprehensiveness of protecting the plates and some of the scary experiences they had. But she also tempered that. Found an account from Catherine that was kind of neat. She said, remember, it's only a couple months the plates are in the home there in Palmyra. But she said, when the plates were in our home, you could feel the spirit in every room in the house. So she had that recollection. That's the only place I found that a reference to that. So some neat recollections about those early experiences. Catherine leaves some accounts of the migration from New York to Ohio that we don't have in any other sources. She talks about her mother leading one of the contingents out of New York to Ohio. Talks about that influence on her, watching her mother lead and assertively deal with different situations such as hunger and having to procure the steamboat to go from Buffalo Harbor to Kirtland, and how effective her leadership was. And I think that Catherine's a lot like her mother. She even looks more like the Mack side of the family probably than the Smith side, and just very similar in the way they would speak later in life, sharing some of the same kinds of things. And so I think her mother had a great influence on Catherine. She marries Jenkins Salisbury. We have a photograph of Jenkins that survived that I have in the book. They're married by Sidney Rigdon not long after they arrive in Ohio. Jenkins Salisbury is a convert from New York, so he will migrate in that same company with Lucy Mack Smith and Catherine. Kind of a funny story is that during the migration, Lucy will separate the men from the women. And I wondered if that was one of the reasons was because of this relationship that's developing between Jenkins and her daughter Catherine. But they marry not long after coming to Ohio. He was fairly inconsistent as a provider. He's a blacksmith by trade, and he struggles a bit with. There's some accounts of him using alcohol and abandoning the family at times. So Catherine had a rough road, I think, with Jenkins. Several times he's expelled from the church, 1833 and again in 1836. He does go with Zion's camp. He is put into the Quorum of the 70, but then is expelled again in 1836 just after the temple dedication. Family for about 3 months, and so the Smith family is having to step in and kind of care for Catherine, provide for her during that time. She has 2 children by then. By 1836, a son, Solomon, and a daughter, Lucy, by that point. But Jenkins still follows the Smith family, follows them to Missouri, follows them to Illinois, but he's outside of the faith for nearly a decade, 1836 to about 1845. Catherine will spend a lot of time in Kirtland at her parents' house, even though they have a place out in Chardon, Ohio. She remembered that while we lived in Kirtland, my mother and myself spent our whole time in waiting on the comers and goers, in cooking and washing. Joseph Smith Sr. oversees the women's work efforts on the Kirtland Temple. I think that included some of those curtains that were lowered down to kind of divide different rooms in the Kirtland Temple, providing clothing for the workers, some of those kinds of things. Catherine's there, and she often recounts some of her work efforts behind the scenes to help build the Kirtland Temple. She and her sister Sophronia participated in weaving clubs. Catherine could work a loom throughout her life. Some of her children had some of her pieces that she had quilted. She's working on quilts sometimes at RLDS general conferences. She's finishing up quilts. And so that was something that she enjoyed, was working with loom and working and weaving fabric. Maybe somewhat similar to Emma, she loses several children. She lost her first child, Elizabeth. She lost several other children in the late 1840s. I think I mentioned that Lucy is her firstborn, and then Solomon second, both born at Kirtland. Alvin is born as they're migrating from Ohio to Missouri. So Catherine gives birth en route on that trip. In fact, she gives birth in an abandoned hut near the Mississippi River. And just to kind of show you Catherine's strength, the next day she travels 20 miles in a wagon. Hardly interrupts the trip.
Wow.
So she's gritty, she's tough. And
How old were those children that had passed away of hers?
Elizabeth, as her firstborn, 1832, dies that same year, so she only lives a few months. She has a child named Emma, born in 1844, named after her sister-in-law, Emma Hale Smith. Lives 2 years, dies in 1846. And then Lauren Ephraim is born in 1847 and doesn't survive the years. Those three die in infancy. She has 5 surviving children in all. Now, just in case I forget, Jenkins Salisbury dies early, so he dies in 1853. So Catherine is going to be a widow, and we'll talk about in Hancock County for nearly 50 years.
Wow.
So she's left to raise those boys. Her daughter marries early, but she has those 4 boys to raise, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But she's had difficulties in her marriage, and then her husband dies, and then we'll talk about kind of how her financially she struggles a little bit. Joseph often invited Catherine. She ends up living in a place called Plymouth, her and Jenkins, before he passes, Plymouth, Illinois. The reason they're down there, it's about 40 miles south of Nauvoo, south of Carthage, is because William Smith has a hotel down there. And so I think she'll work at the hotel some. Jenkins establishes his blacksmith business down there. But Catherine recalled that Joseph would send for her and the children at the holidays every year. And so they would come to Nauvoo, and they had fond memories of coming to Nauvoo during the Christmas season. Catherine said, "We often visited Nauvoo, where my brother Joseph entertained us royally and gave me silk dresses and other valuable presents." Catherine said they sent her home laden with food, money, and clothing. And where they struggled financially, that was a great blessing to her. Joseph will stop by Catherine's home on his way to Springfield during a trial, and he will give, Willard Richards kind of leaves an account of how poverty-stricken they are. And Joseph will give her all the coins he has in his pocket. And supposedly, according to one of the children, he accidentally gave them his lucky penny, which was a penny from the year the church was organized in 1830. And so they kept that kind of as an heirloom. Catherine also had several blankets that I think were quilted by Emma Smith in her possession. And I think she sends one actually to Salt Lake during a Jubilee celebration, said that this was made by Emma. And so she stays close to Emma. They're good friends. She names one of her children after Emma. Catherine's sons will act as pallbearers at Emma's funeral as well. So that relationship continued after Joseph's death. Catherine does leave an account of her final visit with Joseph and Hiram. the week of the martyrdom. This is how she described it. She said, Joseph took my hands tenderly in his, saying, "Goodbye, Sister Catherine. When this trouble blows over, I shall come down to Plymouth and make you a visit." Hiram also bid her goodbye with a tone of voice that had a deeper feeling than I had ever known him to entertain. I shall never forget that Saturday, June 22nd, when I last saw my brothers alive. It was my farewell to them on this earth. So Catherine experiences a lot of hardship too during that time. There were notes tacked to her door down in Plymouth: "Get out or be burned out."
Mm.
And Jenkins' business, his blacksmith business, is just starting to kind of get off the ground when they have to leave, and they sell their property for a loss. And they will bounce around. We may not have time, but in the book I kind of talk about all their episodes. They went to Beardstown, Illinois for a time. They come back to Nauvoo for a time, and then they're going to try to find work in St. Louis. But the skiff that they took down there ends up capsizing and falls into the river with all their belongings.
Yeah. Wow.
And so they were already poor, but they end up in Alexandria, Missouri for a time. They spend the winter there. Catherine gets ill. One of the babies dies. They're actually being cared for by the community because they have nothing. Eventually a friend kind of comes down and brings them back up to Webster, which was Ramus during the saint's stay there. And that's where they'll kind of settle after the martyrdom. They are in Nauvoo for a time before they permanently settle in Webster, but they've had a rough go of it.
And so
Go ahead.
I was going to say, were they spared persecution during those following years, or did it pretty much follow them for a long time?
Yeah, I'll talk about that because they end up settling right there on the eastern edge of Hancock County. But I just wanted to give you a feel for the family. So after the summer of 1844, who's left in the Smith family? So just to kind of go through the family members, remember Alvin dies in 1823 in Palmyra, right? Then you have Joseph Sr., 1840 in Nauvoo. Don Carlos dies a year later, 1841. Then you have Hiram and Joseph, of course, in 1844. And a lot of people don't know, but Samuel a month later, in July 1844. So who's left in the family? You've got Mother Lucy Mack Smith, her 3 daughters, and then William Smith, who's actually on a mission in the East for another year, doesn't return until May 1845. So it's Mother Smith and her 3 daughters there in Nauvoo. So you can imagine kind of how that would be for them. And Emma as well. I'm doing a little article right now on Emma and right after kind of the martyrdom and some of her apprehensiveness of trying to provide for her children, and Lucy Mack Smith kind of the same way of, how are we going to make a go of this and provide for the family? They're worried about it. And you can imagine Catherine in a similar boat, especially when her husband dies in 1853. So Catherine and Jenkins settle in Fountain Green, Webster area on the eastern edge of Hancock County. Her sisters go a little bit further east. They go into McDonough County in a place called Colchester, Illinois. And so they're a little bit more distanced from some of the persecutions that the Smiths experienced in Hancock County. But Catherine settles right next to some of those who marched to Carthage and participated in the killing of her brothers. And so she tries to keep a low profile. I think a lot of the Smiths tried to keep a low profile and maybe even hide their identity, and I think they tried to do that for a time, but eventually it becomes noised abroad that this is the sister of Joe Smith. And so Catherine and her children experience a lot of persecution there, living in Hancock County. Several stories. Her oldest son Solomon said that there were no young folks that would invite me to parties or have anything to do with me. I was called a Mormon, boycotted, abused, slandered. One of the accounts I talk about in the book, Solomon would often go to work for farmers in the area who would often curse old Joe Smith when I was within earshot, and their wives would refuse to let him eat with others at their dinner table, even though he was often miles from his own home. In one instance, he began taking Sunday walks and attending Sunday school with the gal who was about his same age, whom he described as pretty as an artist's dream. Solomon felt that the affection was mutual until she abruptly quit their excursions. When he finally encountered her and asked her if he had done something wrong, the girl's little sister disclosed that their father, quote, forbade her going with me because he says you are a Mormon and he doesn't want anything to do with you. That was a deeply painful experience for Solomon, and he confided in his history that even after 70 years, it was one of the wounds that has never healed. Don Carlos, a younger brother of Solomon, one of Catherine's younger children, recalled swimming in a creek below Webster when an older boy named Jack Brody snuck up behind him and put him in a headlock and began dunking him in the creek. Whether it was true or merely meant to intimidate, Brody boasted that he had been in the mob that killed his uncles and crowed that it would be a service to the community if he killed a Mormon. Don Carlos felt that Brody would have killed him that day if it hadn't been for an older neighbor who happened upon the scene as Brody repeatedly held his head underwater for extended periods of time. So Catherine eventually kind of pulls her children out of school, and she will educate them in the home. One of her sons, this Don Carlos, actually is taken in by Sophronia. So Catherine's sister Sophronia takes Don Carlos in and provides him with a better education than the rest of Catherine's children. So she will send him to, Sophronia sends him to regular school and then sends him to cadet school. And Don Carlos will eventually serve in the Civil War for 3 years. And just the influence of that education that Sophronia provided for him. One of his daughters, Don Carlos's daughters, works as a surgeon.
Oh.
Another works as a university president. Has a grandson that's a Harvard professor. And so you can see kind of that influence as you go down through the family line because Sophronia provided that education.
Wow.
Yeah. One of the most challenging incidents for Catherine was in 1880, and I have a chapter on this in the book. Catherine's son Alvin is married, has several children by this point, but there was some real tension between North and South after the Civil War in Hancock County, Illinois, and that persisted. And Alvin goes to a political rally with a neighbor who is from the South, and Catherine, obviously, and her family support Northern views. She was very opposed to slavery, if you read her writings, some of those kinds of things. And so Alvin and this neighbor get into an argument at this political rally, and the neighbor kind of insults Alvin's deceased father, Jenkins, and calls him a drunk. And Alvin takes off his coat and he's ready for a fist fight. And the neighbor, pulls out a Bowie knife, slashes Alvin across the chest, who wasn't really expecting a knife. He was just looking for a fist fight here, and eventually sinks the knife deep into his skull and kills Alvin at this political rally out in Fountain Green. And Alvin survives for a few hours. He's able to identify the man who killed him. I imagine Catherine kind of being called in from the countryside to see him pass away there. The man escapes for a time, but he's captured the next day. He's tried. In fact, he is held in Carthage jail. And so you can imagine how this was for Catherine, the reminders of her brothers being killed in Carthage jail, and here her son's killed and the murderers in Carthage jail. So a very painful episode for Catherine. Says that she was brought upon her bed for a time with the mourning that she has. Alvin's family kind of leaves the area, goes to Kansas, so it's almost like she not only loses Alvin that day, but she also loses the family within a short period of time and never really sees them again. They never come back. Mm. But it's interesting that it kind of represents a turning point, I think, for the Salisbury family, where they've had this persecution through the years. The community really comes out and supports Catherine at the funeral. In fact, the turnout is so large they have to move it to a larger church, and supports her during the funeral. And it's almost like Catherine and her boys eventually overcome some of that persecution by their good living in time. So that's Alvin, one of her children, and more of what Catherine had to suffer there. Sometimes we think talking about succession maybe a little bit. Sometimes when you read some of the family members' accounts of things, it's almost like they imply that the sisters were supporting Joseph Smith III's leadership immediately once he assumes the presidency in 1860, and that's not really the case. Catherine begins to be visited by some of the Mountain Saints missionaries that come out and visit with her. They're excited to come back and visit the sisters, to visit Emma. And so I talk a little bit about that in the book, of their coming back. And Emma's a little cool to the missionaries when they come, but the sisters are a little warmer to these missionaries. And Samuel H.B. Smith, who's basically an orphan, Joseph F. Smith, who's an orphan, are coming back on missions and visiting the family, probably wanting some of those connections with the family. Samuel H.B. Smith will stay the whole winter before he leaves for England with the Smith family, and I talk about that a little bit in the book and what his experiences were like. Emma's a little cool to him, but it's almost like she warms up with more time. And then he makes some good connections with Joseph Smith III and Alexander Hale Smith and Frederick, some of the brothers who were there. But Catherine's very warm, takes those missionaries in, and after their missions, she continues a correspondence with some of her nephews in the West. And a couple of letters that might be of interest, kind of the Smith family position where they were at during the time. She writes to her nephews in 1865. So she's still not affiliating with the RLDS Church. And she's kind of frustrated with Joseph Smith III. She says, "They, Joseph III and his brothers, have entirely forsaken us, our family. They manifest no interest in our eternal welfare, and they have never invited us to come and take a helping hand with them. For my part, I would be exceedingly glad if all of us, the connections one and all, could live in a society together and believe in one Lord, one Savior, one faith, and one baptism. It is the sincere desire of my heart that we could see eye to eye and rejoice in the Holy One of Israel." So, kind of interesting. She never comes west, but very friendly with the traveling missionaries. Lucy Milliken, so Catherine's sister, daughter Lucy, also writes a letter, which I think is interesting, about the same time. It's 1863. Her and Arthur write to their nephews, "I think you and all the Smith family should look into this matter of succession and see if you are not the successors of Joseph the prophet and Hiram the patriarch, and should lead and govern the church in the last days. I do not see how you boys can preach Brigham the successor to Joseph, or that he has any more authority than he had when Joseph died. I never believed it, nor never shall believe it." So what was most important to them is that it should be a Smith. So whether that was Joseph F. Smith in the West or Joseph Smith III in the Midwest, it needed to be a Smith. So I find that interesting. That's 1860s when they're writing those letters.
Oh.
Eventually, Catherine, actually it's her son Solomon, goes through kind of an illness experience in 1872, and he has this kind of dream as he's on his bed and really struggling to get out of bed, and he has this dream, and a messenger comes to him, and this messenger says, "What are you going to do with your life, Solomon?" And he says, "Well, I'd like to do some good." And he says, "Well, what do you want to do with that good?" And Solomon says, "Well, I'd like to make a difference in the world." And he says, "Well, send for Joseph Smith III," the messenger says. And so he sends for Joseph Smith III, and Joseph Smith III comes out and gives him a blessing of healing, and the next day he baptizes Solomon in the RLDS Church.
No.
And Catherine, I think, is supportive of that. Before that, her boys are kind of running wild. She's worried about them adopting her faith, which was very important to her. She's often preaching to them, even after they're married, that they needed to be more religiously inclined, and this feels like her answer. So Catherine will be rebaptized by Joseph Smith III in 1873. She's the only one of the sisters who's actually rebaptized. And all of her children will eventually affiliate with the RLDS Church. Now Solomon becomes a preacher, and he's over the district there that includes Nauvoo during that time period. And he will affiliate with Alexander Hale Smith, pretty close to Alexander Hale Smith. Catherine is fond of Alexander Hale Smith. He'll often come out and preach in their community. but all of her children will eventually join the RLDS Church. Katherine will kind of be viewed as a living link between the early church and the RLDS Church. And I have some interesting pictures in the book. One is a kind of a print that they did that would be sent to RLDS meeting houses with all the leadership on it. And interestingly, it has Lucy Mack Smith on the leadership board, Emma Hale Smith on the leadership board, and Katherine Smith with those leaders, like with the apostles and with the first presidency and some of those kinds of things. So I thought that was interesting to find that, where Katherine's pictures on that print as well. Katherine will eventually kind of sit on the stand at some of the RLDS meetings. They'll invite her to be on the stand with the leadership, and she will speak. In the 1880s and 1890s, she will speak at some of the RLDS meetings. And that's where you get some of the accounts of those early events of the Restoration. And the audience is just captivated listening to Katherine recount these details because she was present. And I have just one account from a reporter who was present in 1895 at the Stone Church in Independence, Missouri. This is what the reporter said. Several times she was overcome with emotion during her allusion to former scenes as the congregation listened with rapt attention. Prayers of thankfulness were offered by many members for the privilege and blessing of having Mrs. Salisbury present. There's something in the aged woman, recounted the reporter, who had listened to Katherine's gripping narrative, in the knowledge of her long and strange experiences that attracts the attention of all who hear her. And she would recount some of those early events of the Restoration during those meetings. And she added some details that we don't have in any other sources. She said that Moroni had a girdle about his waist when he appeared to Joseph. Talks a little bit about his clothing. Talks about Alvin being appointed to accompany Joseph to the hill Cumorah before he passed away. And so some of those details that maybe corroborate other accounts from Joseph Smith. One thing that I think is interesting is Katherine, because she kind of establishes with her nephews in the West, she feels comfortable enough to write to Brigham Young in 1871. And she asked for money to help her build a house out in Fountain Green, Illinois. And this is what Brigham Young writes back. The memory of our beloved prophet is deeply cherished in the hearts of the saints, and for his sake, his relations and members of his family, notwithstanding differences of opinion, are kindly regarded. And he sent her $200. So Katherine starts building her home there in Fountain Green, and she underestimated the cost. And so she writes to Brigham Young again, I'm going to need more money to finish my house. And ultimately, Brigham Young sends her about $1,300 to help build a house and to purchase 40 acres of land. And I have a little picture sketch of that house in the book. But George A. Smith will visit Katherine and talk about how happy she is to have a home of her own for the first time in her life. And her son Frederick and his wife will live with her there. But Katherine writes to Brigham Young, and she said, "My gratitude to you is unbounded. I shall ever pray for blessings to rest upon your venerable head. I will send you my likeness, photograph, and I wish you would send me yours in return, that I may look upon it with thankfulness for the great help you have rendered to me in the hour of my greatest need." So kind of neat. And even Joseph F. Smith and Orson Hyde, after Brigham Young's death, send some additional funds to Katherine to help her out.
Wow.
In later. Some of her letters are kind of interesting to look at. She would often include those in the West in the faith. So I highlight a few letters. One, she says, may the blessings of heaven rest upon you and all the church, writing to those in the West. Yours truly, Katherine Salisbury. This is from your sister in the gospel. She signs the letter, Katherine Salisbury. From your sister in the Church of God, Katherine Salisbury. So I just find that kind of interesting that she would close the letters that way, of including those in the faith, even though she's affiliating with the RLDS Church by that point. So kind of interesting. Any questions you have so far, or comments?
I have questions, but they're about some of your other books that you've written. So I was just waiting.
Okay.
I was waiting for you to finish on Katherine.
Okay, let me just share a couple more things then in closing, and then if you have any questions. Katherine started to have a birthday celebration towards the end of her life, July 28th, every summer. So she'd gather all of her posterity. She had grandchildren, great-grandchildren by that point. She'd gather them all to rural Fountain Green, Illinois. And pretty soon, kind of word leaks, and you start to get dignitaries that are coming too, and church historians that are coming to interview Katherine. And it becomes this major celebration. And Katherine was just elated to be able to prepare for these celebrations. She had she would make mincemeat pies for the occasion. Some of the grandchildren would determine whether they were the favorite based on the size of the slice of pie that she would give them. But it was a fun time for her to gather all of her posterity, and we have a few pictures of those gatherings in the book.
So is one of those
Yeah, go ahead.
pictures that you have? There's a photograph of her with some of her children, and Alexander's in this photograph as well.
That's right.
He's my great grandfather, and she
Oh,
died in 1900, right?
1900,
And he
yeah.
died in 1909, and I have to think there had to have been conversations between the two of them. I don't know if we have access to anything that she wrote in journals, about stuff, but I would have thought her living that long, he would have asked her a lot of questions.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're referring to anything particular, but in that picture with the RLDS leadership, there's one of Katherine and Alexander's on her right in that photograph with some of the local leaders. I think that's taken in Burlington, Iowa, just across the river from Nauvoo. But it's a nice picture with her in older age with Alexander.
Right.
Alexander will baptize some of her children, grandchildren through the years. So I think she's closest to Alexander out of all of Emma's children. And he kind of looked out for her, I think. So they seem to have a close relationship. She didn't keep a journal, Katherine, but she does write some letters about Alexander preaching in the area, coming out at her request that she makes in the Saints Herald newspaper, often requesting preachers to come to her rural area to preach. And so Alexander would often fulfill that. I do have one account that's written by Warren Orr, who was a judge of the Illinois Supreme Court. And I think it kind of summarizes the Salisbury's experience in Hancock County. He's writing it to Solomon, Katherine's oldest son Solomon. But I think it could apply to Katherine as well. He said, "Your life exemplifies the truth of the sometimes doubted statement that right will prevail in the end. When one reads of your early hardships and the persecutions and impositions you suffered at the hands of ignorance and poison-minded intolerance, and yet sees that you had the courage enough to stand up and tolerate the weaknesses of others, and finally conquer their love and respect by your own good living, it gives one hope for the future." A great tribute to the Salisbury family. And as Katherine would gather all of her posterity around her kind of at the end of the day on these birthday reunions, she would recount some of those stories about the early Restoration events. And when she would talk about the first vision, which she would do, not a lot of Smith family members talk about the first vision and differentiate it from Moroni's visit, but she did. And she'd get to the part where the preacher would reject Joseph's first vision. Some of her children would raise their fists in protest. That's where the persecution started. And Katherine would always kind of tell them, kind of temper them a little bit. She'd say, a lot of people didn't understand this. This was hard to accept. And you guys need to understand that. And she always had this kind of tempered approach with her children. And even with reporters that would interview her, they'd ask about the persecution in Hancock County. And she'd talk a little bit about that. But she could have talked so much more about what she had personally experienced after the 1840s. And she never did. She didn't talk about that persecution. And so, I think that allowed her to get along with her neighbors and keep the peace. And so I kind of admire Katherine with maintaining that perspective with all that she had experienced. So that's a little bit about Katherine. I could tell you a little bit about meeting some of her descendants out in Hancock County and writing the book.
I actually would love to learn more about them and reach out to them too.
Yeah.
That would be awesome to
Yeah,
have them on here.
I have a couple of pictures that I sometimes show, but Estel Neff, if you know him, he was had a bookstore on Mulholland Street there in Nauvoo for years and years and years. He was a direct descendant of Katherine and joined with the LDS faith and I think worked in the temple there before he passed. He's passed away since then, but he had a few things of, heirlooms from Catherine. He had a few letters in Catherine's hand. He had a few pictures. Another woman I met was a woman named Mary Dennis that lived out in West Burlington, Iowa, across the river. And she had inherited it. It's interesting, it kind of came through the female line. All of Catherine's letters, she had her photo book. And the first picture in the photo book was of Emma. She also has the earliest picture of William Smith in that book. And so she just had all of these wonderful items, and she wanted them preserved. And so we were able to take pictures of those. In fact, the William Smith photo is used in the first volume of the Joseph Smith Papers. But we were able to acquire that from her before she passed, and it's now housed in BYU's special collections down in Provo. And so it's nice that those items could be preserved. She had a Lucy Mack Smith's history signed by George Albert Smith and sent to some of his relatives out in the Midwest. Just some really priceless items. Letters had Don Carlos Salisbury's letters from Civil War letters that he had written home to his mom. Some of those kinds of things that were just priceless.
No.
And
Do you
so,
know if that penny, Joseph's lucky penny, is still
not
somewhere?
that I know of. Nope. I think that quilt may have survived. I don't know if the Daughters of Utah Pioneers might have that quilt that Catherine sent out during that Jubilee celebration. Yeah. So,
Interesting.
what other questions did you have?
So I'm currently reading your book on William. So when it comes
Okay.
to family dynamics, that's one because I've studied the family a long time too, and that's one I've been curious about, and how his disposition was a lot like his Uncle Jesse.
Yeah, maybe so.
And I've seen that those attributes kind of come down through the line, and so I kept reading your book and I was like, oh my gosh, that's my dad. That's my dad. There's my dad. So this seems to be a genetic
Yeah, maybe.
predisposition. If you were to put a name to it, because I've wondered, is it? There seems to be a little narcissism there. There seems to be some bipolar type behavior.
Pride, lots of pride. I think that
Yeah.
follows the family.
So yeah, I was just curious about your take on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I try to be careful with to use Stephen Harper's phrase, diagnosing the dead.
Right.
But I do highlight some of the symptoms that I think people could maybe work with and draw some conclusions from with William. Certainly impulsive, headstrong, had a temper. Some of those kinds of things you certainly pick up on. What's interesting though with William is I found he visited the doctor in Iowa in later life to try to get a Civil War pension. And the doctor talks about almost like he struggled with some mood concerns. And usually you wouldn't get that, right? You'd never get a doctor's report from a 19th century figure.
Right.
But you got one on William.
Yeah.
And he talks about his mood, uses some interesting terms back then that we wouldn't use. But
Kind of like a
but it
mood
seems to
disorder.
refer to his mood as well as his health, his physical health and his mood.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Um,
certainly there was some of that there, and I think maybe Uncle Jesse too, Joseph Smith Sr.'s brother Jesse.
Yeah. The other thing I want to ask you about, there's a chapter in United by Faith on Hiram, and I've always said I don't think there's enough said about Hiram, but there's this really touching part where he's written letters to Mary while he's in Liberty Jail, his wife, and she doesn't get these letters, and he's over the period that he's in there, he is distraught because he thinks she's abandoned him. Can you talk about that? Because when I read it, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is heartbreaking." I don't think a lot of people know.
That Hiram felt like Mary had kind of abandoned him.
Yeah, and this process of him writing all these letters, but she's actually not getting them, and she doesn't understand what's happened until after he's actually let go. So he doesn't even know till he gets to Illinois that everything's okay.
Yeah. yeah, just kind of, and I think you pick that up, maybe even with Joseph and Emma sometimes, where he's wanting, more writings from her and more letters from her, and maybe it speaks to how alone they felt in Liberty Jail during. So I don't know what your question is specifically with that, but I don't. I think their relationship seems solid once they're back together, but I'm sure it was difficult during that time.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not my chapter, that one on Hiram Smith. I think
Yeah.
Ron Esplin wrote that chapter, but he seemed to have some good insight about, what that reveals about the relationship. There just isn't that much. I wish there was more, even on Hiram. You'd think there'd be more that has survived. Somebody was asking me, could I write a book on Samuel Smith? And I kind of discouraged him. I wrote a chapter on him, but you're not going to really get to know Samuel in a biography. There's just not enough there to really get to know the person.
Mm.
So you could do it. I mean, his journal is, walk this many miles, baptize 3 people. That's about all you're getting. I mean, I guess you get out of that he worked hard and he's labored hard as a missionary, but you don't get to know the person too much from the journal.
Yeah.
Hiram's a little bit that way too, although there's more on Hiram than Samuel.
And you see that sometimes in Joseph's, when he writes in his journal, met with the brethren today, went home, and I'm like, what did you do? What did you talk about?
Yeah.
What happened when you
What
went
did you think?
home?
Yeah, yeah. So often it's filtered through other people. That's why it's nice to have, Lucy you get a lot on. Katherine you can get a lot on. Joseph I think you can get enough on because there's so many people around him. Some of the others is tough. Like I'd love to know more about Don Carlos Smith, who seemed to have some of the charisma of Joseph and as a leader very early on. Emma says that Don Carlos was the most handsome man she had ever seen when outfitted in his Nauvoo uniform. Katherine says basically the same things.
No.
Very tall and handsome in his prime, and yet dies like Alvin at age 25, very young,
No.
taken before his time.
Hmm.
Wow.
So as far as Catherine's homes that where she lived, are any of the places that they lived after Joseph's death, are those homes still standing?
I've been out in the cornfield there. I think I found where the location was, but it's out in a cornfield, out in rural Fountain Green.
No.
It's been gone a long time. There was a schoolhouse where the children had attended and where William Smith preached when he's affiliating with the RLDS Church. That was still standing when I was doing my research, but it's gone now too. I think a tornado knocked it down, but it was standing 5-10 years ago.
Mm.
Wow.
But she's out there. She's out there in the middle of nowhere, kind of the country. She's not even in the town, like the town of Mountain Green or Webster. She's buried in Webster, and a lot of people might want to visit the cemeteries out there to see the 3 sisters of Joseph Smith. She's buried in Webster Cemetery and has a nice headstone there. And then Alvin, the one I talked about that was murdered, is buried right there too. So you might take note of his grave if you get out there.
Oh.
As well as Jenkins.
Yeah, I live in Nauvoo, so I'm gonna have to make that trip.
Look at the graves there. Yeah. And the cemetery is well cared for. And then if you go a little further out in Colchester, in McDonough County, then you can see Lucy and Arthur Milliken. So this is daughter Lucy Smith and her husband Arthur Milliken out there in the Widow Moore Cemetery. And then Sophronia is buried in a different cemetery in town in Colchester as well. So the 3 sisters, if you ever want to take a trip and see where they're buried out there. I actually tracked down some of Catherine's sons' headstones out in the countryside as well. And they're even further out in the countryside where they're buried. But
And
it's been fun to track them down.
how long did Sophronia live till?
She dies in 1876, I believe. So just, Catherine's affiliating with the RLDS Church there. Sophronia dies just a few years later. One account says that the other sisters were received on their original baptism, which was true for some of those who were members of the faith.
Emma as well, yeah.
Yeah, and so their affiliation is probably minimal. There's no RLDS branch where they lived. So it's probably, only when Joseph Smith III came through, maybe on a preaching tour, that they would secure the church house and listen to him preach there. But there's no real branch they're affiliating with. So she's She dies in 1876, and then Lucy Milliken, daughter Lucy, dies in 1882.
Oh,
Oh,
I think Arthur dies her husband Arthur dies that same year. So
wow.
they're gone by the early 1880s. So Catherine's living, almost 20, 25 years beyond her sisters there to 19.
Wow.
But they stayed close. I mean, they weren't too far apart in distance where they would often support each other. I have some accounts of Catherine and Sophronia babysitting the grandchildren together,
Hmm.
and getting together to go to Emma's funeral. Some of those kinds of things have survived. Sisters stayed close.
Yeah. And where did Sophronia end up living? Was she?
Colchester. Yep. And her daughter, her only surviving daughter, marries into kind of a wealthy family, the Woolley family, and so Sophronia is able to purchase her own home there in Colchester, and it's still standing, by the way. I've been in that home. Lucy's is not, but Sophronia's is. Part of her home, I think, is original there in Colchester. But Sophronia has no posterity.
Oh, wow.
Her daughter dies, and then she has a granddaughter, but she dies young too, and so she has no surviving posterity.
So Sophronia only had one child.
She had two daughters, and I think one dies fairly young. Only one survives to adulthood. And she marries and has a child, but all of them die at younger ages, so no posterity.
Crazy.
Yeah. Lucy Milliken, by contrast, she has a large posterity, and some of her descendants are still in that area of McDonough County.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Kim, any other questions?
no, that's this has been fascinating. I do have your book on Catherine. It's in line with a lot of other books.
I know how that goes.
I got to finish William first.
Yeah.
That's great. It's good to meet you both.
Yeah. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for doing this and helping us learn and studying them. It's
Yeah, it's been fun.
amazing information and really sad to hear all that they've gone through. So,
Yeah. Well, I have a great appreciation for the Smith family. I come through the Knights, Joseph Knight and Newell Knight, so they were friends of the prophet. So
yeah.
I always feel like that friendship continues today.
Yeah,
with
my
them.
husband goes through Newell Knight.
Is that right? No,
Uh-huh.
well, that's
That is
great.
really
So
awesome.
related.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time.